Some might say Greg Perry was a cold person, but that was not the case. He was passionate about many things. He just never lost his composure. If he raised his voice, it was not out of passion or anger, but a conscious decision to emphasize his words. But he was a kind, fair, and loving person. His main passion was his wife, Susan, with whom he had been married for 25 years. He also loved and was proud of his children, Melissa and Jude, but they were already grown. Melissa had graduated from university with a good degree and was building her career, and Jude was in his final year of university and would soon be starting his own life. Greg was very proud of his children, but was looking forward to Jude's graduation so he could enjoy the empty nest with Susan. On this last Monday in August, Greg sat at his desk and wondered if there was anything more he could do to convince the board of directors to accept his desire to retire early or at least go part-time. It had been over 6 months since he promised Susan that he would start planning to reduce his workload. She retired last year after being laid off, and they decided it wouldn't be worth it for her to try to restart her career elsewhere if Greg was retiring soon. So he promised her to be free no later than Jude's graduation next year. But he knew that she was becoming impatient and bored at home alone. The children were gone, and she missed them. She was involved in charity work at her church, but turned down Greg's offer to learn to play golf so they could go to the course together. In fact, Greg smiled when he thought about it. Their church and his golf were the only things that separated them besides work. On Sunday, she went to her God, and Greg talked to him while playing golf with friends. Greg went back to thinking about how to convince the board of directors to agree to hire him part-time. The problem is that the council was afraid to let him go. Greg founded Perry Consulting Firm 15 years ago. His calm manner, his ability to turn problems into opportunities, his optimistic outlook even in difficult times helped him succeed. And he could remember times in business when things had been very difficult. But now they seemed to be calmer times and the company was growing steadily. Greg had a trusted right-hand man in Tom Good, and everyone expected Tom to take his place when Greg retired, but the board of directors was not ready to let him loosen his grip. Last month, Greg tried to talk about this with Phil Trimet, an outside director and successful local businessman who supported Tom and wanted to accelerate his progress. Greg hoped that Phil would be able to influence some of the directors and persuade them to his opinion, but there was no change yet. At that moment, when Greg was immersed in his thoughts, there was a knock on the open door of his office. Paul Benson, the CFO, hesitantly rolled up to his desk in a motorized wheelchair, waiting for Greg to tell him if he had time. Paul joined the company 9 years ago when, after a horrific road accident left him with very weak legs, he could only stand and take one step and was left completely paralyzed in his left arm. He was a qualified accountant, but no company in town wanted to hire him. Only Greg did not see the connection between a person's ability to walk and his ability to do accounting, and immediately offered him a job with a proper salary for the responsibility. "Yes, Paul, how can I help? I thought you might like to see this list of charitable donations we are going to make this fiscal year before our meeting tomorrow." Paul handed Greg a piece of paper. "Oh, thanks. Something that might cause controversy?" "Don't think. 80% of them were on the list last year. New recipients are shown in bold. And you used the same percentage of gross profit as always." "Yes, it's basically your money, so if you're happy with it, then who am I to argue?" Greg glanced at the list. All charitable donations the company made went to local small charities, Friends of the Hospital, local mother and baby support groups, and the like. Greg then noticed one he didn't know about. "What is Help on 43? 43 Manvers Street. This is a counseling center for addicts. They help them find accommodation for the night. They know which shelters accept addicts. Help them receive full social benefits despite their problems. What about helping them get rid of illegal substances? It would help them more." "Oh no, this is the point. They are not taught. Their way of life is not questioned. This is for those who are not yet ready to give up their habits. This is to help them stay safe while they are ready to make major changes in their lives. Greg looked up at Paul. Never. What's wrong with them? I'm not going to spend my money, and as you rightly pointed out, I still hold most of the shares, so it's basically my money on a group of people who are intentionally hurting themselves and probably everyone around them. But they need help until they start to sort out their problems. Greg sighed. Look, Paul, I don't have to tell you that I don't mind helping people who are trying to help themselves. People who have gone through a difficult time, even if it's self-inflicted, but are trying to get out of their problems deserve my respect and support. As far as I'm concerned, we know we have at least 2 former addicts, 1 recovering alcoholic and 1 with a prison history, and about 4 registered disabled people, including you, who are rebuilding their lives, and we will give them all the help we can. Greg looked at Paul and answered his unspoken question. And no, you don't need to know who they are. But they're doing well, and good luck to them. But there's a world of difference between respecting and helping them, and that crowd of losers who want someone to fix their world for them. So take that organization off the list and redistribute the money, okay? Will it help if I say that my wife volunteers there? No. I admire Jean for trying to contribute to society, but let it help people who have problems through no fault of their own and who respond to the help provided. This is just my opinion. Sorry, but she won't get my money. Fine. I'll review this before the council meeting tomorrow. The next day, the monthly council meeting went well. No one mentioned Greg's pension, and the charitable donations were approved without objection. Greg was happy with everything until the agenda reached the miscellaneous section. Paul then raised the issue that C&G Services had not paid their bills for 9 weeks. Paul was not concerned about C&G's creditworthiness, but there was a potential cash flow problem for Perry Consultants. There was general cheering in the room that C&G was their largest client, employing over 20% of the company's consulting team. There was some discussion about whether anyone had heard the rumors about C&G, and Phil Tremott said he played golf on Sunday with their managing director Leslie Goodman. Phil suggested that they might be in the very early stages of takeover talks. Greg sat listening to the discussion, annoyed that Paul had not informed him of the potential problem much sooner. But then Tom Good, knowing what his boss was thinking, leaned over to tell him that Paul had reported the situation to him and they were monitoring it closely. It was time for a firm hand, Greg decided. Paul, what percentage of our turnover comes from C&G? Paul looked at his notes. 21.4%. What is their contribution to our gross profit? 12.7. So they're not nearly as profitable as our smaller clients. Okay, where are we on the crackdown? Tom took the floor. We've already sent them our strongest and final warning. Legally, we're in a position where we can recall our employees at any time, although we wouldn't want to. Maybe I should go and make Leslie Goodman pay. Greg looked at him. No, it's time to play hard. Remind them again that they are violating the terms. But if we don't get the money by tomorrow night, then on Thursday tell our guys to report here Monday morning instead of going to C&G. If we let our guys know on Thursday, C&G will have Friday to collect their thoughts and pay their bills. Greg's associates were suddenly worried that Greg was ready to give up their biggest client, and he felt a wave of anxiety. Greg looked around, looking at the faces of his colleagues one by one. I don't mind giving good terms to such an important client. We'll do everything we can to help them. But they broke the damn contract. Sorry, but if we broke our part of the contract and didn't provide people when they needed them, they would turn us inside out. Either they will pay quickly, or we will discuss a new contract after this event. Greg looked around at his colleagues again. No one dared to speak out against it. So he said to Tom, Tom, can you give me a plan tomorrow for what we'll do next week if C&G doesn't get paid? I'm guessing we'll have to lay off people and make sure it's freelancers. I know some of our best consultants chose the extra money from self-employment, knowing that we would be hiring them for years. Well, they will know what the disadvantage of self-employment is. Our loyalty is first and foremost to full-time employees, so freelancers will be the first to go. But let's hope that it won't come to that, okay? Yes, Greg, but I don't like this situation. I think we could do it in a less confrontational way. It's not me who broke the contract with C and G. It's them. It's out of our hands. Plus, it will give us a chance to raise prices if they want to come back to us. Or we can use our best people with some of our smaller and more profitable clients. Greg looked around at his directors again. Well, if there are no more questions, let's adjourn this meeting. Thank you, gentlemen. The meeting ended and Paul Riley noted to Greg that this was the first meeting in months where his retirement was not mentioned. Greg noticed that Phil Termite was standing quite close as he responded loud enough for Phil to hear. Well, I guess I'll have to accept that you guys won't let me go. I give up suggesting anything else. Greg hoped that this would encourage Phil to start undermining him and hasten his retirement. The following Monday, as Greg was working at his desk, Leslie Goodman burst into the room. "What the hell are you up to, Greg? I thought we were friends." "We were friends, and I hope we're still friends, but I can't let my guys work for you if you don't pay for it. It's that simple. You've been warned several times, both officially and I'm sure unofficially." "Yes, it's true, but I never thought that you would carry out your threats. I thought that I was too important a client for you to just throw everything away because of a few days of delay in payment. Here is your money. This is the bank check. It won't bounce, and we can get back to where we need to be." Greg accepted the offered check and took it to his secretary. "Take this to Paul for credit to the bank." Greg returned to his desk and smiled at Leslie. "Would you like some coffee?" "Yes, please." "Okay, as soon as my secretary gets back. By the way, Leslie, why did you stop paying our bills?" Yeah, well, we had a special audit, and I just wanted to improve our cash position, if you understand, Greg. We lost a few accounts in the bottom drawer for a while. It sounds a little fraudulent, to be honest, but that's your problem, not mine. I heard there's talk of a takeover. Now that definitely won't happen if they come today. We've practically stopped without your guys. Well, I remember telling you at dinner when we signed the contract last year that you were a fool for relying on us so much. We should be consultants and interim managers, not subcontractors providing all your key personnel. Yeah, after this morning, I guess I'll have to think about that. Anyway, I won't wait for coffee, thanks. If you can get your guys back after lunch, let's forget about this misunderstanding. Yeah, Greg? Sorry, Leslie, but they won't be there after lunch. But I paid you what you asked for, so you don't have anything to worry about anymore. But you broke the contract. We no longer have a contract between us, Leslie. And I checked. Your non-payment canceled it completely. Kaput. We can negotiate a new contract if you want, but I warn you, the prices will be higher. I see no reason to have you as our least profitable client when you don't pay your bills. But on the bright side, it gives you the opportunity to renegotiate the terms to become less dependent on us, if that's what you want. I could contact my lawyer and spend a lot of money, and he'll tell you the same thing I told you, that the old contract ended when you didn't meet the payment terms. You broke it, not me. So what are you going to do? Leslie stared at him and hesitated, reluctantly admitting. He said, "You've got me in a corner, Greg. I think I'll take that coffee." The board of directors didn't approve of what Greg did to C and G, but they had to reluctantly accept that Greg had done it again. All employees on the C and G contract returned to work Monday afternoon as a sign of goodwill on Greg's part. But the new contract was more lucrative and beneficial for both companies. So, on the last Tuesday in September, Greg was looking forward to the board meeting. He looked at his watch. It was a little before 2:30, and he was alone. But then all the other directors came along. This made Greg suspicious. He was not aware of any issues or discussions he was excluded from, and Tom Good did not warn him about possible trouble. But something was wrong. Greg instinctively felt it, knew it. He waited until they were seated at the table. Once they were settled, he leaned forward to begin the meeting. But then Phil Trimett caught his eye. "Excuse me, Greg, before we start with the agenda, could we raise one more question?" Greg leaned back. "Sure, Phil, what's the problem?" "Well, first of all, I think we should congratulate you on your maneuvering of C and G last month. I saw Leslie Goodman last week, and although he's a little miffed, he's quite cheerful about the future of C and G and full of kind words about you. But there's one more thing. Some of us have been talking a little, and we'd like you to clarify your future and possible retirement plans." Greg thought, so they finally want to talk about my retirement. God bless. But they have to approach this carefully. I'm still the majority shareholder, and after last month, I'm a hero. Well, Phil, gentlemen, he looked around the table. Many of his colleagues looked uncomfortable, avoiding meeting his gaze. I think I still have a lot of time to think about my eventual retirement. I was only 50 at my last birthday, and I still have a lot of energy for the company that I created. But yes, I was hoping to come to this council at some point to seek some kind of agreement that would allow me to relax a little, but not yet. As Jude will not retire completely, I have truly come to terms with the fact that you will not allow this to happen. Phil Trimett seemed to be their spokesman. We're not here to push you out, Greg. We all appreciate how you've built this company. There was a general murmur of support from everyone around the table, but we're starting to think that the company is moving into a new phase of its development, and perhaps now is the time to transfer some of the responsibilities to Tom. Maybe you'll think about it. Take your time, but now, maybe it's time. Greg looked around the room and thought. He guessed that the little incident with C and G had been more unpleasant for some of them than he had expected. He always believed that a problem was an opportunity. Like the C and G problem, he turned into an opportunity. And it was an opportunity to please Susan, and he wanted to grab it with both hands. If the board was willing to offer the right deal, there were vacations and adventures ahead instead of work, and the full approval of the other directors would put the minds of outside shareholders and auditors at ease. Well, gentlemen, maybe you're right. I thought I wouldn't even bring this up again, after your reluctance last time, until next summer at least. But if you all think it's time for Tom to do more, well, let me make a suggestion to you. Greg was silent for a moment, looking out the window, but without focusing on anything in particular. He collected his thoughts. They were probably relieved that he didn't fire them, grateful that they seemed to have survived this mild but critical confrontation. They would probably agree to more than he could afford to ask for. I could hand it over to Tom this afternoon. He could become general manager today. I would stay, but all the day-to-day operations would be on his shoulders. Now, if you agree to extend my vacation from what it is now, and not ask me how much, I've never taken a full vacation in all that time, as you remember. But if I could take 20 weeks, say, at my full current salary, of course, then maybe I'll take the opportunity to step back a little. The directors looked at each other and then at Phil Trimett, awaiting his decision. I suspect we're all a little scared of losing you, Greg, but we think this is the right time for Tom to move up the ranks, although we were hoping you'd be with us a little more often than this. Oh, don't worry about it. I want to travel a lot with Susan. There are so many places we've never seen and so many interesting things to do wherever we go. But with modern communications, satellite phones, and the internet in every hotel where I stay, you can always contact me. Just call me or email me. Provide me with the right phone and a new laptop, and I will always be with you, except on holidays. I'll be here 32 weeks a year. How about a 5-year contract? Greg looked around the room. The directors looked at each other, not sure what to say. Greg resolved the awkward pause. Listen, I'll leave you for a few minutes. Talk to each other, and then let me know. I'll be in my office. Greg stood up and walked out the double doors into his office. Tom left through another door, saying, I think I should go. since I may be the beneficiary of your decision." Greg sat at his desk, smiling to himself. No one disputed the full salary part, and he expected to have to offer at least a 25% pay cut to convince them to agree to it if he offered it without Phil's motivation to bring it up. 5 minutes later, Phil Trimett knocked on his office door and asked Greg to return to the meeting. "Greg, I hope you'll be pleased to know that we fully approve of your generous offer. And I want to add my personal thanks for the tactful manner in which you handled what could be a delicate discussion." Greg turned to Tom Good, who had just walked through the door, and patted him on the back and said, "Congratulations, Tom, it's all yours now." And there were 5 minutes of general bonhomie before the meeting resumed with the original agenda. After the meeting, Greg spent a few minutes talking with Tom to sort out some immediate handoff issues, but left most of it for the next day. Then he sat down at his desk and allowed himself to daydream. Air safari in Kenya, St. Petersburg, railroad travel through the Rocky Mountains, Taj Mahal, river trip on the Nile, the Great Wall of China, Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, cruise on the Pacific Ocean, traveling through the Australian desert to Alice Springs, bungee jumping in New Zealand, whitewater rafting, trekking to Everest Base Camp in Nepal. Oh, wow, that would be a real challenge, as well as the usual tourist attractions. After all, he was only 50 and still in great shape. Adventure, that's what he needed, with Susan by his side, and now he had the money and time to do it. Life was definitely looking up. His thoughts turned to Susan, his life partner for 27 years and his wife for 25 of them. At 48, Susan was still a sexy and attractive woman. She was perhaps a little fuller than on their wedding day. She must have worked hard to maintain her weight, and she had to visit the hairdresser more often than before to hide the gray hair that was appearing. But he was still proud of her. She'll be thrilled to know that he kept his promise to slow down a little and spend more time with her, even if it's not full retirement. They'll celebrate tonight. Greg decided to start his new life with a big surprise for Susan. No, with two big surprises for Susan. First of all, he will come home early. It will be a surprise. Second, he'll book a 2-week vacation somewhere warm and sunny where they can relax and really talk about their plans for the future. Greg arrived home at about 6 o'clock, with a bottle of champagne in his hand and confirmation of his Seychelles booking in his pocket. He called Susan, but she was upstairs and said she would be down soon. Greg put the champagne in the refrigerator, and as he left the kitchen, Susan came down the stairs. Greg greeted her with a kiss as he hugged her. "Hi, are you having a good day?" he asked, deciding to postpone the news until dinner. What would be the best setting to discuss the future and surprise with a trip to the Seychelles? "Hey, honey, what brings you home so early? Not that I'm complaining." "Oh, I'll tell you about that later. It was a big day for company politics, and in the end, I decided to come home early," Greg replied as they headed into the living room. He sat down in his usual chair and noticed that the TV was on standby. A small red light was on. This was unusual. Susan rarely watched daytime television, and he was sure he had turned it off properly last night. Well, let's turn it on. He rarely had time to see what was on at this time of day. The TV was tuned to a sports channel. It was strange. Not impossible. Susan could watch tennis if it was on, but unlikely. The television came to life and began broadcasting a golf tournament somewhere in the world. Greg involuntarily stared at the screen, couldn't help but stare. "One of your guys left it at golf," he said without much thought. Their fictional boyfriends and his fictional obsession with a fictional blonde barmaid at the golf club were part of their private jokes. Within their strong relationship, it's easy to joke about such things. "Oh, I let them watch while they waited. You know, when they stand in line, waiting their turn with me in the bedroom," Susan replied. Greg will revise this answer again and again in the coming weeks. Was this her pause, or a slightly different tone in her voice, or the wrong accent? He still couldn't understand. But after 27 years, love and partnership, He knew it was insincere. He just knew it was something in her voice. He stood up and turned to look at her. She looked at him, slightly challenging and trying to half smile. Finally, she looked away. How about a drink before dinner? After 27 years of love and partnership, she knew when he realized she was lying. He continued to look at her. She turned back to him, and her face said it all. She looked shocked, guilty, and hurt all at the same time. She had a lover. Greg suddenly felt his stomach tighten, and his heart begin to pound in his chest. But he found the strength to say first, "I'll go pack my bags. We'll talk later." And he just left the room and went upstairs. He was trying to stuff too many suits into his clothes bag when she walked into the bedroom. "Greg, we need to talk. Please. I'm so confused. My thoughts are a mess. But I know I love you. So please, Greg, let's talk." Greg looked at her, tears silently rolling down her face. "We can talk in a few days. Then we can decide what we both want to do." He noticed that his voice broke with unspeakable excitement. "Please don't go, Greg," she approached him. For the first time in his adult life, Greg wanted to scream at her, really scream, but he knew that would be foreign to him and their relationship. "Who and for how long?" was all he said. "David Shiner, you've never met him," she whispered, but Greg heard it as if she was screaming. "David Shiner? No, I don't think I know him, but I think I heard the name. Maybe you mentioned it." And Greg continued to pack his things into his bag. "And what? And how long did this last?" Greg picked up the large suitcase and placed it on the bed, then walked over to his dresser. "We met about 4 months ago, but we've only really gotten closer in the last month, and it's only gotten physical in the last 2 weeks. Susan's voice remained quiet. 2 weeks, huh? So how many times was that? 1, 2, 3? Greg asked, his voice now taking on a menacing tone, although he remained calm. 4. 4. Oh. Greg continued packing in silence. Susan just stood there and watched, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Both were silent. Perhaps neither of them knew what to say. Greg finally finished packing and zipped up his suitcase. He lifted him off the bed and looked at Susan. "I'll go to the River House Hotel. At this time of year, the season is already over. I think they have a room. If not, I'll let you know." "Oh, please, Greg. Please, let's talk. This is absurd. You can't just walk away from a 25-year marriage without talking." At least Susan stopped crying. Greg looked at her. "We'll talk in a couple of days." She just looked at him. She was pale, with red eyes, and her lips were trembling. "Do you love me, Susan?" he asked. "Yes, Greg. I love you. You are my husband and my life." "Well, then, when we talk, you can start by explaining how you combined jumping into bed with another man, not once, but 4 times, with this supposed love for me, with your religious beliefs, with your marriage vows, data when you stood at the altar in front of our friends and family. Start by explaining it, Susan. And if you can't explain it to yourself satisfactorily, then don't even try to explain it to me." Greg took the bag strap over his shoulder and lifted the suitcase. At the same time, he almost threw his jacket off his shoulder, and the white envelope fell to the floor. Susan bent down to pick it up. "What is this? You dropped it." Greg glanced at him. "This is confirmation of a holiday for the 2 of us in the Seychelles, starting the day after tomorrow. I bought it for you as a surprise. Today I agreed on my partial retirement. We were going to travel, see the world, meet new people, and try new things. Looks like you're ahead of me on some of these things, Sue." He took the envelope in his free hand and walked past her, heading towards the stairs. He walked down the stairs, and Susan looked after him. All she could purr was, "Please, Greg, please." Greg Perry checked into the River House Hotel. The receptionist seemed nice and cheerful, and Greg was able to strike up a small conversation with her while they were getting him into his room. "Okay, thank you. I'll take my bags to my room, but could you do me a big favor? He asked. If I can, sir. What is it? She was still smiling. Could you please ask the bar to have a very large gin and tonic ready for me when I come down again in about 3 minutes? I really need it. Why don't you have someone else take your bags to your room and you go straight to a drink? I love you, Greg said, and headed into the bar. After drinking a large gin and tonic and meeting George, the bartender who seemed to be his new friend for the next few days, Greg went to a restaurant. He ordered a plain steak, cooked medium rare, with a side salad, and a bottle of decent red wine. The steak looked good, Greg thought, but he really couldn't give it a full rating based on just 2 bites, and he tested the salad by tasting 1 piece of tomato. The waiter watched him. Greg drank some of his wine and stared at the painting above the fireplace. Eventually, the waiter came over. Are you finished, sir? Greg looked at him as if he were a visitor from another planet. Yes, I think so. You can take it. Sorry to your chef. Aren't you hungry, sir? No, I have too much on my mind. Sorry. Perhaps you would like something else, sir? No. I think I'll take this bottle of wine and my glass and go sit on your terrace and think. Is that okay? Yes, sir. But I think it will be quite cold there. I wouldn't be surprised if it freezes. Well, maybe the cold will help me return to reality, where food didn't help. Greg smiled faintly and walked out with a bottle and glass. Greg was sitting on a bench on the terrace under the light of several garden lamps. He was lost in thought. Questions swirled in his head. Answers, too. In this series, some questions were never answered. Others had several different answers. He poured the last portion of wine into his glass and, holding the glass and bottle, slowly walked towards the river bank. The river was dark and quiet as it slid along, lit only by the distant street lamps on the city bridge downstream. Greg began to feel a rise of anger, not at Susan and this David, but at himself for not being able to come to any firm conclusions in his thoughts. He couldn't find any hard facts that would help him begin the logical process of thinking about what he should do next. Then, from the depths of his brain, his business attitude emerged. Susan broke the contract. He knew he was loved and cherished throughout their marriage. He thought, but was no longer sure that she did too. They definitely performed in sickness and in health. Thank God it was mostly in health. The only illnesses were the occasional flu in the winter and the common cold, and he once sprained his ankle when he fell off a curb. He knew that he rejected everyone else, but she didn't. She had broken her marriage vows and the contract was dead. Divorce was merely a matter of legal recognition of what had already taken place. The marriage is over, kaput. This realization somehow cheered him up, and to celebrate, he threw his bottle into the glassy black river and could see it slowly floating towards the bridge and the sea, like some slow, majestic marker of his past life, floating forever. A problem is an opportunity. Susan and this David suddenly opened up to him a whole new freedom to choose his life from that moment on. What does he want? He could try to make peace with Susan if she wanted to try, and they could call off the divorce. Or he could start a new life on his own. The choice was his, and except for an immediately happy marriage, everything was possible. Greg returned to the bar where he ordered himself a large whiskey and sat on the bar stool, watching George work and making small talk with him when the bartender had a moment. Gradually, the evening crowd dispersed, leaving Greg and George the only ones in the bar. Greg looked around, realizing that George would probably want to close the bar. He pushed his glass towards the bartender. Pour another big shot, and I'll let you close, George. Of course, sir. George poured another double shot of scotch through the optical dispenser and handed the glass back to Greg. It seems to me, sir, that some woman has let you down. Am I right? Is it that noticeable? Professional bartenders only, sir. Would you like to talk about it? Greg took a long sip of whiskey and stood up. Not tonight, George. Maybe I'll tire you out of it tomorrow night. He drained his glass and slammed it onto the bar. He belched and swayed towards his room. Greg fell into a restless sleep, but woke up early. He stood at the window, looking at the river in the morning light. He knew he had to confront Susan to tell her he would begin the divorce process. Only then can they begin to consider their future paths, together or apart. He also knew that it would take a tremendous amount of willpower to have a civil conversation with her rather than a bitter exchange of insults. Once it was acceptable, Greg went to breakfast. Now he was hungry and ordered a full English breakfast with many cups of tea. After breakfast, he went down to the river, but only to call his secretary in privacy and inform him that he would be late for the office, although he did not explain why. Greg pulled up to his house, big and expensive, on the right side of town. Although he had the door key in his pocket, he rang the bell and waited. Susan answered the door. She was pale. Her hair was a mess. She had no makeup on and was still in her robe. "Hey, Susan. You look like I woke you up. Sorry, maybe I came too early." Susan looked at Greg and took a step forward. "Oh, thank God, Greg." But Greg stepped back. It was not a planned reaction. It was an automatic reaction to avoid this woman, once so well known and loved, and now a stranger. "I'm not here to make peace, Susan. I just want a few minutes of your time to have a civil conversation." Susan lowered her hands and looked at him. "Yes, of course, sorry." She turned back into the corridor. "Just civilized conversation, Susan. No hysterics. No tears. What's done is done. It's just about what we do next. Let's go into the kitchen. Greg, would you like a cup of tea?" "Why not? Let's have some tea and talk about divorce. It sounds civilized, doesn't it?" Greg sounded bitter, but he really felt bitter. In the kitchen, Greg started making tea. Susan just sat at the kitchen table and looked at him. She knew him well enough to know that she had no choice but to wait for him to speak. Once the tea was ready and Greg had placed it on the table with the cups and milk, he sat down and simply looked at her, at the woman who represented 27 years of his life. "Oh, Greg, I'm so sorry. You should never have gotten hurt over this. Please, I promise you, we can get through this." Greg looked at her. He felt a strong urge to scream, to really tell her what he thought of her, to show her how much he was suffering. But what would that give him? Nothing. "I don't need to listen to your excuses," I said. "I want a civil conversation. It won't help if you just sit there and sob about how sorry you are. Just like it won't help me to tell you how much I hate what you did to us, and how much I hate you for becoming a lying bastard who not only made a mistake, but came back and did it again and again. It was a cold-blooded, deliberate decision on your part to cause permanent damage to a happy, trusting person. 25 years of marriage. But you know that." Greg swallowed. He had gone further than he ever intended. He had to pull himself together. If Susan had been pale before Greg's outburst, she was even paler now. She sobbed in shock and then began to cry, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Susan. That was cruel. True, but cruel. But maybe it was unnecessary. Okay? Dry your tears. We need to talk." Greg quietly poured the tea while he waited for Susan to calm down. He pushed the cup across the table towards her and took a sip of his own. Finally, Susan blew her nose and raised her head. "You're right, Greg. I shouldn't be surprised that you think that way about me, or that I even know it myself. Just hearing it from you. I'm sorry, I must have really hurt you." "Well, Susan, I have a couple of questions for you. Would it be helpful if I explained a little bit about why this happened, how I felt with David?" Susan asked, speaking almost in a whisper. "No, I don't need to know. I'm not sure I'm even interested. Just answer a couple of my questions. Am I correct in understanding that you knew exactly what you were doing when you went to bed with him 4 times? There was still bitterness in Greg's voice, and Susan noticed that he couldn't say David's name. "Yes, Greg. I knew what I was doing. I never thought you would know. It was what I wanted. No, needed to do. Was this the first time? Or is he just the latest in a long line of lovers over the years? Should I check Melissa and Jude's DNA? Greg asked, calmly and deliberately, looking straight into Susan's eyes. Susan looked down. It's a terrible thought, that you could even think that way about me. No, there were no other lovers. For 27 years, you were the only man in my life. I promise you this. Well, that's good to hear. But it seems to me that the outcome of your little affair is inevitable. Susan inhaled sharply. She intuitively knew what to do next. Susan, you have broken the contract. As far as I understand, we are no longer married. I will have a lawyer begin the divorce process immediately. I don't know if this will help you, or whether it will give you freedom in your relationship with your lover, but I don't think it will. We had some obligations or responsibilities to each other. The marriage was broken when you went to bed with him. You admitted that you knew what you were doing and confirmed it 3 times. All we need to do for each other is make sure we properly divide our assets and provide support for Jude until he finally separates. Susan just stared at him, completely stunned by his words. No discussion, no questions about the reasons for her action, about how they could overcome it. Only the finality of the divorce. I don't want a divorce. Greg, Susan's voice rose in desperation. I love you and I want to stay married. I didn't sleep all night. I understand what I did, and I know we can get through this. I know this won't be easy for you, but I'm sure you'll get through it. I know you won't walk away from everything we mean to each other, our wonderful children, our lives, our friends. Greg looked at her. Once the divorce case is well advanced, perhaps we can meet and talk about what happened and what each of us wants in the future. If we both want to stay married and we can get over it, then we can call off the divorce. But now I feel like you forced it. I have no choice. You broke the marriage, and divorce is the inevitable outcome. That's where we are now. That may change in the future, but not until we both get through. A lot of time thinking soberly. Greg looked at her. In fact, I don't even know if you were planning on leaving for your lover. Or maybe you dreamed of spending your adult years being a free spirit, free love, and who knows what else. Maybe you don't even know yourself. That's why we need time to think. No, Greg, I never imagined myself as anything other than your wife, and we are moving towards a happy old age together. I don't need time to know what I want in the future. They looked at each other, each trying to understand what was going on in the other's head. I'm sorry, Susan, but I need to. Now, as you know, I have a holiday planned in the Seychelles. This was supposed to be the start of our new life together. Now I'll go alone and use it to think about what I should be like. My new life, and do I want you to be my partner in it? Could we both go and use this as a way to get us back together? I know it might be painful, but shouldn't we be together and not on opposite sides of the world? No, Susan, we can't. I'll go, and perhaps come back with better thoughts. In the meantime, I don't know what you're going to do with your lover. You might want to continue your affair one last time, or perhaps you hope that I will learn to tolerate this. But be sure of one thing. If you really want us to have a chance to get back together, then you must call him immediately and tell him that it is over. So you are ready to promise me that you will never do it again. Will you see this man? Oh yes, Greg. I promise that gladly and willingly. It wasn't his fault. It was something we both did. But I never want to do it again with him or anyone else. I promise. I called him last night and told him I never want to see him again. Okay, then let's continue this line of reasoning. I know that of all my mixed feelings and emotions since last night, I am filled with hatred and a desire for revenge on this man. I might consider it lucky to kill him. I don't care if you were happy with him, or, on the contrary, he pursued and seduced you. It doesn't matter. He decided to go to bed with a woman who claims to be happily married. By the way, is he married? Yes, he has 3 children. Well, if his wife ever finds out, then I guess you can expect to feel the same depth of hatred from her. But that's none of my business. What I want to know is If I decide I want revenge on this man who intentionally interfered with the destruction of everything I love and believe in, will you help me destroy his life if that's what I want? Are you willing to do that to help me deal with this and get me back, Susan? Susan winced, realizing the terrible emotions she had awakened in Greg. I don't know, Greg. This is so unlike you. I don't like seeing this side of you. And David isn't some creep cheating on his wife. He's a good man who made a mistake, just like me. There's nothing wrong with him. Must happen. No, Susan, you were right the first time. A bastard who cheats on his wife is exactly what he is, and he deserves everything that happens to him. But I don't know what I'm going to do about it. You're right about my character. I've never taken revenge on purpose before, but maybe this will be the first time. They sat and drank tea in silence. Both were lost in their thoughts. Susan broke the silence, deciding one last time to try to make peace. Come home, Greg, even if you sleep in the guest room. What do you think people will say when they find out you moved out? And then we could talk, I could explain. No, Susan. First of all, I don't care what people think, and I'm sad that in this whole situation that's one of your first concerns. And second of all, I don't need you to explain anything right now. You did it. You chose it. Not once, but 4 times. And you admit that you knew what you were doing every time. You knew that you were betraying me, our marriage, everything you ever claimed. That's all I need to know. Now I need to decide if I want to live the rest of my life with the person who did this, or what I can salvage from this mess you created. Susan simply collapsed in tears, and Greg quietly stood up and left. Greg arrived at the office and immediately told his secretary that he was now living at the River House Hotel, and why. By the end of the conversation, she was crying, and through her tears she asked Greg if he knew what he was going to do. Yes, start divorce proceedings, and then I'll think about what I want after that. It might include reconciliation. Greg spent the day consisting of a series of short meetings with Tom Good, as Tom continually approached Greg about various issues as Tom took over the leadership of the company. Between these meetings, Greg made several phone calls around the city. First to his lawyer to arrange a meeting, but he was not able to see him until the next day. He then started calling old friends and colleagues, just discreetly asking about David Shiner. Did anyone know him? Who is he? An hour or 2 later, Greg found out David's address, that he seemed to be happily married with 3 children, that he was about 40 years old, and most interesting of all, that he worked for TMD Electrical. After lunch, Greg called Ed Maskell, TMD's CEO and Greg's occasional golfing buddy. Greg invited him for a quiet evening drink at the River House Hotel after work. Greg was talking to George when Ed arrived. After greetings and some business talk, Greg turned the conversation to what was on his mind. I invited you tonight to talk privately because I need your help. I'm sorry to inform you that Susan and I have separated, temporarily or forever, I don't know yet, but we have problems now. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Greg, is there anything I can do to help? No, not directly, but you can look after Susan for me. You see, she's having an affair, and since you're a frequent visitor to All Saints Church, I think Susan might seek the church's support while she sorts out her thoughts. Well, I'm sure there will be gossip among the parishioners, so I decided to tell you directly, so that you can protect her a little if the rumors are too offensive for her. I am on the council of the parish church, so you have come to the right place. I hope that she will be treated with decent Christian charity, but the church will not bless such behavior if what you have told me is true. Oh yeah, it's true. A short fling with a guy named David Shiner. I don't know him, but she seems to know him pretty well, from the looks of it. She doesn't deny it. David Shiner, oh my God, he works for us at TMD, We've had him for about 8 or 9 months in the marketing department. He works for you, right? Well, I guess he needs to work somewhere. Greg reacted with innocent surprise. Yes, and he's married too. Lovely wife, I met her at a summer barbecue. And kids, 2, I think, but maybe 3. Well, there's a lot I can't do. As you know, Greg, we can't today interfere in the personal lives of employees. But I don't like it. I have morals, you know. That's why I go to All Saints. Ed paused to look at Greg, who seemed to be listening intently but looked surprisingly relaxed. Well, I can't fire him, but if it's any consolation, Greg, I'll be damned if he gets a promotion. His promotion has been discussed. There was talk about making him director of marketing. Well, just over my dead body, Greg, but I don't like it. And I don't like it either, Ed. Not the way I look at it, Greg said with an ironic smile that he hoped would hide his inner feelings that the mission was accomplished, and easier than he expected. After Ed left and Greg actually ate his steak this time, he returned to the bar to sit on what was quickly becoming his favorite bar stool. As the bar gradually emptied, George had more time to talk to Greg, and Greg decided to tell George about his problems. Between serving the occasional other patron, George listened patiently. At the end of his story, Greg looked at him. And how many times have you heard such a story? This year, 3 times. You're the 4th. And I'll tell you what I told all those guys. Life is what you make of it. How the hell is this supposed to help me? Well, if you want to get back to your wife, then don't doubt that it's possible. But if this was the last straw, then go and build yourself another happy life. It's up to you. Life is what you make of it. The wisdom of bartenders. Hey, don't reject it. Just drink it. And George poured Greg another whiskey. On Thursday, Greg met with his lawyer and told him to begin divorce proceedings. The lawyer strongly recommended that he first try to reconcile, at least sit down and talk with Susan and listen to her story. But all Greg could do was get reassurance that the process could be quashed if it was appropriate. But he felt that at this point, the marriage was broken and divorce was the natural consequence. After a visit to an attorney, Greg decided that some financial precautions would be prudent. He opened new bank accounts and transferred his salary to his new personal account rather than the joint account. He tried to cancel some of Susan's credit cards, but that was easier said than done. However, one thought haunted Greg. Destroying David Shiner's career did not give him the satisfaction he expected. He still felt pure malice towards the man. He could understand and even accept the anger he felt towards Susan. It came with resentment and despair. But towards David Shiner, he had only anger. Finally, on Saturday morning, he couldn't resist the urge to drive to David Shiner's house. He stopped the car in front of a neighbor's house and sat watching. David Shiner mowed the lawn, back and forth, in stripes. He looked exactly as Greg had imagined him to be, a perfectly normal early 40s guy, not too fat, but probably a little plumper than he had been in his 20s. He had less hair than Greg had imagined, with a noticeable patch of baldness at the back. But he looked like an ordinary, normal guy. How appearances can be deceiving, Greg thought. As he watched, the woman left the house and went to the garage. She drove out in the family station wagon, this year's model according to her license plate. But Greg realized that this was not surprising. Shiner was at a new job. After she parked the car in the driveway, the wife disappeared back into the garage. And then the 2 boys, Greg estimated they were in their early teens, came out and grabbed 2 bikes from the garage and drove off, shouting that they would be back in time for dinner. His wife came out again, picked up a shovel, and sat down to weed the flower bed. The whole scene exuded homely innocence, and this made Greg even angrier. Greg got out of the car and walked over. "David Shiner?" Greg called. Shiner stopped the mower and looked around. Greg walked up the driveway, almost to the parked car. "Yes, I'm David Shiner," Shiner said, leaving the mower and walking towards Greg. The wife stopped weeding and just sat down, watching with interest. As Shiner approached Greg, Greg said, quite clearly and loudly, "I'm Greg Perry, husband of Susan Perry." Shiner's face paled, and he quickly glanced at his wife, who was beginning to stand up. He was still looking in that direction when Greg's fist hit him in the face. Only once, but very hard. a little to the left of Shiner's mouth. David Shiner staggered to the side and fell against the car, his shoulder hitting the mirror so that when he slid down on his bent legs, everyone heard his shirt tear. Greg simply turned around and calmly, decisively walked back to his car. Mrs. Shiner rushed towards her husband, shouting, "Hey!" but she simply crouched over her husband, holding his head. Greg sat in the car and suddenly began to shake. His whole body trembled, and then he began to cry. But through his tears, he watched Shiner and his wife. She was talking, but he couldn't hear what she was saying. But then she started punching Shiner, striking him with a series of closed fists. It really hurts, Greg thought. Slowly, he came to his senses and drove back to the hotel. George was behind the bar. "Whiskey, please, George." "You look worried, sir. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Feeling better, actually, but my knuckles are a little scuffed," Greg said, forcing a tight smile. "And he probably has the right nose, I guess, sir. I think it was his lips and mouth, but you get the idea." "Well, then this whiskey is at my expense, sir." After dinner, Greg lay on his bed and listened to soft classical music on the radio. He felt calmer than he had in days, and he decided that he was now free to actually think about what he wanted in the future, rather than just being a bundle of emotions about the past. As the room began to darken as the sun set and the soft music was still playing softly, Greg's phone rang. He picked it up and looked at it. "Yes, Jude. How can I help you?" "Hey, Dad. What's going on between you and Mom? I just talked to her, and she's completely upset. I finally couldn't get her to talk clearly. She says you left her, and that she did something. That terrible thing. I don't know if it was before or after you left. Like I said, she was too upset to really talk." "Well, yes, Jude. She's right. I left her. I was wondering how I could tell you and Mel this. Looks like she got by without my help." "So what's the matter? You can't just leave." "I just can't imagine it. Dad. It's not easy for me to say this, but I left when I found out your mom was having an affair. I guess that's the terrible thing about her. I'm sorry, Jude, but it's not my fault." "No, Dad, you must be mistaken. It's not like Mom to do something like that." "Stop it, Dad. She just couldn't." "I thought so too, but we were both wrong. His name is David Shiner, and she knew him for 4 months, as it turned out, and they had an affair for about a month. She swears otherwise, but as far as I know, they can be together right now. This could be the love of her life. I don't know, Jude, and honestly, I don't think I care." "No, Dad. Maybe she let her feelings go one time, or he pushed her into it, or, I don't know, something. But from what I heard this afternoon, she seems to be very regretful. Don't leave her. You probably can't." "I've been thinking a lot this afternoon, and I think I have a choice. But the first thing I accepted was that your mother ruined our marriage. She broke our agreement. I have to admit, it's hard to understand. After 27 years, you think you know a person, and I would never imagine that she would do this. Yes, she could be unhappy or tempted, but to do this goes against everything she believes in. But I have to accept that she did it, and I need to decide how I want to spend the rest of my life." "With Mom, probably, Dad. You really can't imagine life without her, can you? Not now, not this week, but somehow when you look into the future." "I have to, Jude. I have to. Oh yes, I'm sure we could work something out. It won't be easy. It will be a long, painful process, but we could work something out if we both wanted it. And I don't know if she wants it," I asked her, but she didn't have time to realize how terrible this period would be. "But let's say we did it. So what kind of partnership do I have then? We'll work most of the time, but where will I know that in her eyes I'm worth less than a quick connection with this David Shiner? This will be with us forever. It was her choice, and it won't go away, no matter how hard I try. Or any therapist, counselor, or your mother. 25 years of our marriage were worth less than an affair with another man. Now, is this the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with? Oh, Dad, who is this David Shiner, by the way? To be honest, I don't know him. But what I do know about him is that he's a pretty average marketing manager. He's a few years younger than your mom and works at TMD here in town. Your mom says he is married and has 3 children. What's happening to them? Does the wife know? I think she knows now, and I don't think they'll be making up anytime soon. Well, at least not kissing. You couldn't, Dad, not you. Where are your ideas that you always taught us about respect for other people and that fighting doesn't solve anything? I guess I forgot to give you the chapter on exceptions to the rules when we raised you. Sorry about that. And besides, it didn't solve anything, but I felt a hell of a lot better in the end. Oh my God, I don't know what I think about this. My dad is hitting somebody. I know that if every guy here who's upset because some girl double-crossed him twice and he slaps the other guy, then first aid would have been indispensable. Yes, that's how it should be when you're 20. When you're 50 and happily married for 25 years, different rules apply. Does Mel know about this? Asked Jude after a pause. No, I think your mom, or I should tell her, but she's in Spain with Carl right now. I think she'll be back at the end of this week. Your mom knows the exact date. Do you think I should come home? I can. It means I'll miss a few lectures, but no one will mind considering the circumstances. Well, if your mom really needs you, I wouldn't. I'd love to see you, but I think your mom and I have a lot to think about, and no one is going to help us with that. Greg sounded humbled by the lonely task. Okay, if you're sure. Take care of yourself, Dad, and you'll tell me once you and Mom decide what to do, okay? Of course, and you just keep enjoying life. That's what you're supposed to do. And don't worry about the future. No matter what happens, your mom and I love you very much. Both of you and Mel. I know that, Dad. That's what makes it all so. You know? Yes, I know. Don't worry. Bye, son. Bye, Dad. Greg closed the phone but sat staring at it for a few minutes. Talking to Jude helped more than Jude realized. Now he knew the question facing him. Did he want to live with a woman who valued him and their marriage so little? Everything else, the why and when, the anger, hatred, and pain were temporary. In the end, Susan will always be the wife who broke her vows and his trust in her. Can he live with this? Does he want to learn to live with it? Greg relaxed. He knew the answer would come to him. Answers always come, with time, and he gave himself a few weeks until he returned from the Seychelles to clear his thoughts. It was Thursday of the following week and Greg was sitting on his bar stool, watching George, feeling rather despondent. He didn't want to eat, but he sat on the bar stool, drank a little, but not too much, and watched George and the customers come and go. At closing, George said, "You seem a little depressed this evening, sir." "Yes. Well, I once had a wonderful marriage with a pretty wonderful girl, and now, how can I live happily ever after this? What you really need, sir, at a time like this, is a really bad girl." "Why? Do you know anyone like that?" Greg asked, smiling and half-interested. "Of course it's part of my job, sir." And so it happened that Greg was saying goodbye to a rather nice girl in her mid-20s on Saturday morning when Melissa walked through the hotel door. "Melissa," Greg greeted her with a hug and a kiss when he saw her. "How was your vacation?" "Oh, that was great, but I never expected to come home to this. I talked to Mom yesterday morning, and she was so upset that I came here last night." "What's the matter, Dad? And who is she?" "This is a girl named Chantel, or that's what she calls herself on nights like this. She's the woman for the night, and I ordered, or rather, George the bartender did it on my behalf. She's actually a single mother and a nurse at a hospital, just complimenting her income thanks to generous gentlemen, as she put it. But this is the first time I paid for sex, and probably the last. Why does this upset you?" "Oh, Dad, how could you? You're still married, and how could you do this to Mom?" Look, I made my decision about your mom. I'm sorry, but the divorce is a consequence of her actions, not mine. Other than a fair and just settlement, I don't owe her anything. And Chantel was the first of my new adventures. I still have a lot of life ahead. I thought that I would spend this time with your mother. Not in the sense of Chantel, I certainly didn't intend to do that. But everything else that life can bring, but that's how it all turned out. Maybe I'll make peace with your mom. Maybe not. But for now, I'm not going to give up all the joys that life can bring. But you can't really get divorced. You can't. I went on vacation with a couple of happily married parents, came home and Mom is so sad. She knows she was wrong. She really knows it. Can't you find a way, please, Dad? Don't destroy your family over this, please. Look, Mel, let's go to the living room and have some coffee. This must be a terrible shock for you. It was a little unexpected for me, too. But that's the reality. Come on, honey, let's talk. And so they did it. Melissa could not offer an explanation for Susan's behavior. She simply tried to accept what was happening and looked for ways to overcome or work around it. But Greg was regretful but adamant, and Melissa knew that once her father made a decision, it couldn't be changed. And honestly, she saw no real reason why he should change that. Then, the following Tuesday, just as Greg had finished work at the end of a full day and was walking through the front desk to his car, a man approached him. It was David Shiner. Greg couldn't help himself. He glanced at the security cameras, making sure that there would at least be a recording of what might happen. But David Shiner recognized Greg's thoughts. "It's okay, Mr. Perry. I just want to talk. Just a few minutes, please." Greg looked at him, but before he could decide anything, David Shiner spoke again. "It's okay. I don't have any hard feelings." And he raised his hand to touch the yellowing spot near his mouth. "You may not have any hard feelings. I'm not sure I don't either," Greg replied, still looking at him seriously. "Okay, 5 minutes, at the pub across the street." Greg led the way without saying a word. He ordered himself a whiskey and looked at Shiner, who ordered a half pint of beer. After receiving their order, Greg led them to a table, and they sat down opposite each other. "Well," Greg said, "first, let me apologize for my role in the end of your relationship with Susan. That definitely wasn't my intention," Shiner began, pausing to wait for Greg's reaction. When there was no response, he continued, "Susan called me over the weekend, which was the first time I'd heard from her since Tuesday night when you found out, and she screamed into the phone that she never wanted to see me again. This time she called to say that you were getting a divorce and that she wasn't sure if I would get involved and that my wife might find out." Again Shiner paused and Greg said, "That was polite of her, but how does that concern me? You know my wife knows about Susan. You took care of that. But after talking to her, I realized that Susan is absolutely broken. I talked to my wife about it. I learned to do absolutely nothing without discussing it with my wife. One of the things this mess has taught me is that we decided that I should see you and ask you to at least talk to Susan. I really fear for her sanity. Thank you for telling me, but we are reaping what we sow. Susan chose not to be my problem. I certainly feel sorry for her, but there is nothing I can do." There was silence between them, both just looking at each other. Greg broke the silence. "Has your wife forgiven you?" "I don't know, not yet. After you visited me that Saturday, I spent the night in the car. But on Sunday, she let me back into the house, at least to talk. We can't afford the huge hotel bills, so I'm sleeping on a folding bed in the office. And we're talking, I think she'll at least agree to counseling. Will it help us overcome this? I don't know that I want it to work. I really do. His wife, Mr. Perry, very much. So why are you having an affair? This is not what loving husbands do." "No, they don't, and I shouldn't have. I guess life was too hard for me back then. I changed jobs. I had to move my family here, forcing my wife and kids to leave their friends. My wife had to quit her job to move. My kids had to change schools, and they're not too happy. We took out a huge mortgage, so money is tight. And I have a new job where I have to make an impression. And I feel like I've failed that too. Why? I came here as a marketing manager, but on the condition that they might appoint a marketing director in the near future. The carrot was in front of me, dangling. Well, last week the HR director pulled me aside to say that they had decided to advertise for the position of marketing director, but that I should not apply. It was informal, of course, but he said that there were aspects of my personal life that seemed unacceptable to senior management. Senior management means Edward Maskell, perhaps. Do you know him? Greg couldn't help himself. Yes, I know him. We meet sometimes to talk. David Shiner looked at him with a very questioning look. Greg gave him his best poker face. After a long pause, Shiner continued. Basically, I think my excuse was stress, Shiner continued. I met Susan and we hit it off, and I thought she was very attractive, and she was probably a refuge from all the pressures. It really wasn't a big deal, at least for me. I don't think it was for her either. But I really don't know why she did it. From her point of view, she definitely knew there was no future in it. It was a little romance, nothing more. I thought it was something like that. I never really thought it was anything particularly significant in that sense. Its meaning was the betrayal of our marriage. 25 years of completely faithful love just thrown away from both of us. I have to accept that it was her choice. Full true love. That's not what Susan was insinuating to me. Maybe it was her way of justifying herself to you. She never had any reason to doubt me or think that I had someone on my side. What I know is that she loved you very deeply and that she is absolutely broken right now. Please, Greg, if I can call you that, please talk to her. Give her another chance. I was shocked and alarmed when she spoke to me. I'll talk to her, but I doubt it will make a difference. And I won't for the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm leaving for the Seychelles for a couple of weeks tomorrow. It was a holiday I booked for Susan and I, and it seems a shame to waste the ticket, so I'll go alone. I loved Susan with all my heart. Maybe I still do. But the divorce is a consequence of her choice, not mine. And I made my decision. Maybe later we'll talk and find someone else. But for now the divorce remains in force. Greg was still looking at David Shiner. He then drained the rest of his whiskey and left. And so Greg went on holiday to the Seychelles, very conscious of the emptiness on half the king-size bed in his hotel room. But he did find some enjoyment, and the sun and swimming were good. Almost every evening he walked along the beach, lost in thought. There was no way to avoid it. He yearned for the security of a loving relationship. He wished with all his heart that Susan would not betray him and their wonderful marriage. But she betrayed. For some unknown reason, she decided that a few hours of sexual pleasure in bed with David Shiner was more important than him. Maybe he should at least find out why. Maybe if she could truly convince him that she was sorry, that it was just a moment of madness, then maybe he should do everything he could to try to find a way back. He really didn't know. What he did know was that he hated his current loneliness almost as much as he hated what Susan had done. So when he returned, he called Susan. "Hi, it's me." "Oh, Greg, good to hear your voice." "Well, Sue, I need to see you. How about tomorrow night? At the house, if that's convenient for you." Susan fell silent. He could almost hear her wondering if he dared to ask what this would be about, if this was the beginning of a restored relationship. But she remained neutral. "Of course, Greg, I'll cook something. Come for dinner. I'll cook your favorite." "No, Sue, I'm coming to talk, not to eat. 7:30 in the house. Then, okay?" "Yes, Greg, I'll be here." And so, the next evening, they sat opposite each other in the living room of the family home, surrounded by many pieces of furniture and art that they had acquired over 25 happy years. They just sat in silence, looking at each other. Greg thought, "God, she looks terrible." He wasn't sure if he was happy, sad, or worried about her. Maybe David Shiner was right. She really was depressed. Susan was becoming more nervous by the second. Greg was trying to find the words to start a conversation that could close such a big chapter of his life. He decided to start from the last time they spoke. This would at least give him an advantage. I think we have a lot to talk about, possibly including agreeing on a financial settlement if we can. We have everything. There's a divorce going on, you know. Susan shuddered. She stared at him in bewilderment. You can't. No. This is wrong. You said we would talk, but we didn't. You can't just end this. I'm sorry that I hurt you. I'm sorry you found out this way. I'm really sorry, but you can't. Just end it like this. Greg, you owe me more than that. Yes, I can. Susan. Yes, I can. I doubt if there is anything you can say. There is no explanation that could change the fact that after 25 years, 27 if you count 2 years that we were together before we got married, you valued our marriage so little that you were happy to sleep with another man, not once, but 4 times. I don't think I want to be married to someone who treats me like that. 27 years of faithful love. I'm sorry. Susan's eyes were now looking at him with indignation. I also contributed something to this. It wasn't one-sided, you know? I had to go through a lot too, live with what I had, and one day, just one time, I had a relationship with someone else that. Yes, including me going to bed with him 4 times, but that was really just one little bout of madness in 27 years. You're not fair, Greg. You're not even talked about it. You're right. I need to give you a fair chance to speak up. In fact, I want you to speak up. Give me good reasons to stop the divorce so that I can be sure of a good and happy future with you. Susan looked relieved that he agreed to listen to her side. I knew you would be fair and listen to my side. Cheating has never been your style. Treason, the word angered Greg. If you mean I cheated sexually, then you're wrong. I've never even gone near bed with another woman in all our years together. I've never been in a relationship with another woman where that was the case. Would be even remotely possible. If you mean I cheated you by working late, traveling on business trips, then yes, I think I cheated you of my time. But I promise you that I would rather have every minute of it. To be here at home with you and the kids. But I tried to build the future that I thought we both wanted. We always discussed it, and I thought we were always on the same page about business and my career. I remember we agreed that I would never travel for more than 2 weeks at a time, and I never broke that. I thought it was this shared understanding of what we were doing that made our marriage special. Susan looked at him, wide-eyed and a little shocked. No, Greg, I'm sorry if you think I was upset about business and your career. I knew how hard you worked for all of us. I never blamed you for that. Ever. There was a long silence between them, interrupted by Susan's question. Should I tell you why I did this? Is it important to you? I'm not sure. I feel like you crossed the line. You chose to break everything we ever had. There were no excuses. It was a hard fact. I'm just reacting to what you did, Susan. I'm not sure yet what I need to hear, if you thought you had any excuses, because there were no excuses. But I promised, and if it helps you. So what about those times you crossed that line, Greg? What about those times? Greg looked at her, stunned. I just told you, I've never crossed that line. Not once have I even come close. Where do you get those thoughts? And if you had doubts, well, why didn't you talk to me about it? I asked. But you always had excuses or lies to get out. When? Greg exclaimed. Susan looked at him but hesitated before answering. You remember that summer party at Tom and Julie's when the kids were very little. Tom and Julie Braithwaite. We were married for about 5 years, just under 5 years actually. I remember it well. Why? You disappeared for an hour, and when I asked you, you just said that you were talking to someone in the house. Well, I knew you weren't there. I was looking for you. And everyone said that the Braithwaite nanny left with some man in a blue car, and we had a blue car then. A week later, Jill Woodhouse told me that you were showing off your little conquest at the golf club. Her husband John told her this. Adventures. Susan looked pleased with herself. Greg looked at her, weighing his words. Well, I didn't lie to you. Do you remember what Tom Braithwaite did as a profession? Yes, he sold cars. That's right. And he and I spent about 3/4 of an hour in their bedroom while I filled out the paperwork for that little red Mini I got you for your wedding anniversary next month. We could barely afford it, and it needed financing. That's why it took so long. So yeah, I talked to someone in the house. And you rode that Mini for years. It's the first car that both Jude and Mel remember. It's part of our family history. Susan wasn't convinced. She didn't want to let go of her conviction. So why did Jill Woodhouse tell me you were bragging about it at the golf club? I don't know. But knowing John Woodhouse's reputation, I'd guess he needed something to distract Jill. They had a blue Ford at the time, if I remember correctly. Oh my God. That was all Susan could say. But if it's been bothering you all these years, then why didn't you say anything? I guess I'm used to being a stoic wife. You know, keeping the family together for the sake of the kids, despite the husband's infidelity. And you cheated, didn't you, Greg? Maybe not that time at the party, but when you are on business trips, don't tell me you've never cheated. But I didn't cheat, Susan. Not once. For 27 years, I loved you. I thought about you so many times every single day of those years, at home, in the office, but perhaps most of all when I was on business trips. I promised to you, I remained absolutely faithful. I already told you this. What about that time you weren't even known at your hotel in New York when I called? You had the nerve to tell me your hotel and you weren't even staying there. Susan looked at him reproachfully. I told you when you asked, when you picked me up at the airport, when I got back. Susan, there's more than one Hilton in New York. You must have called the wrong one. I told you then, and I still do. I think that's exactly what happened because I told you I was going to stay at the Hilton, and I actually stayed at the Hilton. So you say, what about that Sunday a couple of months ago, maybe a little more, in June? I don't know what you're talking about, but I can assure you that it's not what you think. It was Sunday, and I got a flat tire on the way to church, so I was hoping you'd come back from golf and help me. Well, I know you never carry your phone on Sunday, so I called the club. The manager said that you were definitely not there. He saw how your foursome left like a threesome without you. If we're talking about Sunday, he could have really said that. I was late, but I caught up with the guys on the first tee. I stopped by Phil Tremite for a quick chat. I knew Phil wanted Tom Good to take over as soon as possible, but I knew that the rest of the council were hesitant to let me go. So I randomly stopped by to talk to him when I told him that I was only 50 and had enough enthusiasm to continue working as long as the council needed. But it took longer than I expected. In fact, it took 3 months. But I was right. In the end, Phil got support to allow me to go into partial retirement on good terms, just like we both wanted. And I didn't tell you, because I didn't want to give you false hope. I thought it was better to leave Phil to do his insidious work alone. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Greg, this only makes my mistake with David worse. Yes, I think so. But while we're talking about it, why don't you explain what was so great about him? There wasn't really any real reason. I felt lonely and bored, and I was angry at you for still not retiring like you promised. And I was sure you were wandering around in your time, even as recently as last July. So when I found intimacy with an attractive young man who seemed to find me attractive, which was very flattering, it was easy for me to let myself go too far. I am so sorry. And Susan collapsed into tears again. Greg handed her his handkerchief. He had no words. He was stunned. For 20 years, his wife, his life partner, his partner in everything, considered him a cheater. This was the depth of her understanding of him. He was hurt, insulted, and angry. He already had doubts about whether he could truly forget what she had done to Shiner. He wasn't sure if he wanted to stay married to someone who treated their marriage as cheaply as Susan did. But now he realized that she thought so badly of him. For more than 20 years, she had considered him a deceiver, regularly, apparently, and she had so little self-respect that she had come to terms with it. Well, Susan, if you're telling me that your excuse for all of this is that you misunderstood me, that you haven't talked to me honestly about your concerns and fears for 20 years, then I'm sorry, but how would that I'm not upset? I think I'm better off getting out of this. Susan looked at him through her tears. Please, Greg, let's try counseling, so we can understand each other better. I'm so sorry. I love you and I want you back. No, Susan, you love a cheater. Maybe you're noble enough to love like that. Or maybe you have so little self-respect that you could tolerate it, but you don't love me. Instead, you misunderstood me and cheated on me. As he spoke, Greg stood up. Goodbye, Susan, and good luck in your future life. And Greg walked away from Susan, from their home, and from a very large part of his life. Greg was very sad when he returned to his hotel. Somewhere deep inside, he still hoped that Susan would actually say something that would make him step back from the edge. Instead, she insulted him and seemed to think that sleeping with another man was just an unfortunate mistake and not the betrayal he thought it was. As he sat on his bar stool, George glanced at him. Looks like I need to call Chantel again to cheer you up. Greg looked up. I saw my wife tonight, and I told her I'm going through with the divorce. I guess I should be happy. This is the first night of my second bachelorhood, and I have so much to do, so much to make decisions. I'll probably need a place to live. I can't live here permanently. Why don't you talk to management if you need a place independent? They have a couple of self-contained apartments outside. They use them for holiday rentals, but they won't be open until next summer. I think they might be interested in offering you a deal for a few months, and you could use the dining room and this bar whenever you want. A sort of intermediate home to your new life, sir. How about it? That sounds like a good idea, George. I might talk about it. A place to bring the ladies while I enjoy my freedom. Greg smiled faintly, but felt empty inside. He spent Christmas in Thailand, a country where Christianity is not the dominant religion, where he hoped to avoid too many reminders of his lost family life. And that made it easier for Melissa and Jude to stay with their mother without feeling a split in loyalties. The delay in the divorce arose because Susan's lawyers were trying to earn their fees by arguing over the proposed settlement. But when it started to drag on, Greg spoke to Melissa and Jude, and they spoke to their mother, and a settlement was quickly agreed upon after that. At Easter, Greg found his new home. A country hotel just outside the city had gone bankrupt, and a developer had bought it to turn it into luxury apartments, while preserving the hotel's pool, tennis courts, and attractive grounds for the benefit of the new residents. Greg purchased a very nice two-room apartment on the second floor. Once settled there, Greg began using the local shops in the village. And one day he literally bumped into a rather attractive woman at the local post office. The next week, he stood in line at the local grocery store right behind her, and they exchanged pleasantries. Her name was Mary. She was a widow with twin sons who had just left for university, and she had more free time. The friendship blossomed into a cautious relationship, but more than a month passed before they found themselves in bed together for the first time. They then decided to spend a long weekend in Prague, and both enjoyed it. So they decided to try spending a whole week in Madeira, and it was a very happy time for both of them. Jude graduated from university in July, and he and Greg went on a trip across America, which lasted 5 weeks. Greg invited Mary instead of Jude, but she wanted to be home when her sons returned from university, so it became a man's trip, and they had a good time, getting closer than ever. Jude would sometimes gently squeeze Greg's hand or put an arm around his shoulder, noticing how his father would freeze when he saw something that would interest or please Susan. But on the nights when Jude left his father to find younger company in bars and nightclubs, Greg often thought about Mary as well as Susan. But he also knew that for Mary, he was making way for her sons. As soon as Greg returned from America, he was already planning his next trip. He found an organized trekking trip into the Andes Mountains of Peru to follow some of the Inca trails to ancient sites, including Machu Picchu. It involved hard marches on foot and sleeping in tents, and he thought it was exciting, but Mary was not impressed by the idea. Greg began to suspect that not only were her sons more important to her than him, but he now began to suspect that she preferred five-star tourism. He could understand that a single mother would be very attached to her children, but, nevertheless, being in second place hurt his delicate pride, and his doubts about Mary were strengthened by the fact that he knew that Susan really liked to walk and get a little rowdy. Like him, she believed that doing something completely different from their safe, comfortable life added something exciting. For the thousandth time, he wondered if he had made the right choice in divorcing Susan. Finally, after a long and expensive dinner, he persuaded Mary to at least consider traveling to Peru with him. Melissa and Carl then announced their engagement. To celebrate, Greg decided to throw a small party at his new apartment, with Mary serving as host and her twins coming to meet Jude and Melissa for the first time. And, after some persuasion on Mary's part, Greg agreed to invite Susan. As the day of the party approached, Greg became more and more nervous at the thought of seeing Susan again. His relationship with Mary was good, but she was not Susan, and he doubted whether she could ever become as important. With Mary, everything was new, exciting, but not easy, and he really didn't want to play the role of father to two young men he barely knew. And he knew that she was not as adventurous as he was. All this did not give him the security, the comfort that 25 years of marriage had given him. But if she agrees to go to Peru, it might help. What didn't help was Jude. Over beers in the pub one night, he was quite open about his hope that Greg would leave Mary and find his way back to Susan. "She still loves you, Dad. I told her to fight for you, so give her a chance when she does." Greg and Mary's party was the first time Greg had seen Susan since they had been talking about getting a divorce. He was shocked when he saw her. She had gained a lot of weight. Her hair was gray and dull, and her new dress was cheap and did not fit her new figure well. Greg was a busy owner. Carl's parents and his married sister and her husband arrived, and the room was full. Greg watched Susan whenever possible, but she barely spoke to him all day, and she seemed to have had too much to drink. Late that evening, Mel pulled him aside to tell him that Susan was crying in the privacy of her bedroom. Jude then joined the conversation, and they both felt it was time for their father to at least talk to their mother. Greg walked slowly and quietly into the bedroom. Susan was sitting on the edge of the bed, wiping her eyes, but Greg noticed a glass of gin and tonic on the nightstand. "This must be a hard day for you, Susan, but I'm glad you came." Susan looked at him. Greg waited patiently for her to say something. She finally found her voice. "Yes, I knew I'd have to do this someday, but it just reminds me of everything we've lost. Do you feel it too, Greg?" "Yes and no. Yes, we both lost a lot in what you did. But no, an engagement is not a sad day, and Carl is a very nice guy, and he really loves our Mel very much. And I think that the engagement could mean how good life could be in the future for all of us, even after, you know. Maybe for you. You seem to have found my replacement quickly. You sound so bitter." "So what? I have many reasons for bitterness. I devoted myself to my husband, raised his children, and once, just once, I was in a relationship. And what does my loving husband do? He doesn't try to talk to me. He doesn't try to understand. He's just leaving and divorcing me. He's off to travel the world and live the good life with his new little bitch." "Enough. I thought you were better than this. Okay, life dealt you a blow you didn't want or expect. The same is true for me. But it can still be a good life. And if you don't like your life, it's up to you to fix it. But if you keep being bitter and angry and drinking too much, then there's a place at number 43 Manvers Street that might suit you." "What do you mean by that?" "This is a place for people who don't help themselves when life goes wrong. Personally, I don't want anything to do with that." Greg looked at her seriously, then simply returned to the party. Mary did not go to Peru. She knew it was a critical decision, but she didn't want camping and hard work. So Greg went alone. He met a woman named Brenda who was from Australia and was also on this trek. They had sex from the second night onwards, but no real relationship developed. And at the end of the trip, she returned to Australia and Greg to the UK, with vague promises to meet again, promises that both knew they could not keep. Upon his return, Greg invited Mary to dinner, but both understood that their relationship was over. At best, they will remain friends, but nothing more. Without Susan or Mary, Greg felt lonely. He tried to appear cheerful to those around him, but there were too many nights when he sat at home alone, thinking about an empty and meaningless future. His only hope is to plan more trips. Maybe he can convince Judge to travel again soon. Greg would have gladly paid, but Jude had just started a new job and didn't have much vacation time. A couple of months later, Jude came over for the weekend, and Greg treated Jude to a good steak at the local pub on a Saturday night. But no matter how much Greg tried to persuade him, Jude turned down the opportunity to spend a week in Iceland, driving across frozen lakes with his father. They returned to Greg's apartment for a glass, followed by a second and third. When Greg was pouring the fourth cognac, he asked, "How is your mother?" "It's getting worse. She looks terrible and definitely drinks too much. But I'm tired of lecturing her. She really needs you. Dad, are you sure there's no turning back? You still haven't found anyone. And she really loved you, you know, and I think he still loves. So what happened to her fighting for me?" "It was one of my lectures. If she loves you and wants you, why doesn't she fight for you? But she's just too busy feeling sorry for herself." Greg handed Jude his cognac and sat down. Jude stood up at the same moment. "It's time for me to go to bed." And he took a sip of cognac and turned to the door. Greg was oblivious to the fact that Jude was getting ready to go to bed. At that moment, I really wondered if I should forgive her for this stupid affair. But then she told me that she thought I was cheating, having, I don't know how many, connections throughout our marriage. I found it offensive, very offensive. It seemed to make our marriage a sham. But it also showed that she had no respect for herself if she thought she could tolerate this for years. How could I love and respect someone who doesn't respect themselves? Jude took another sip of cognac, turned around and looked at his father. "How's your self-respect, Dad, now that you've achieved your single life?" "Oh, I'm fine. At least I can look at myself in the mirror every morning when I shave." Jude waved his hand back to his father and walked towards his room. He didn't hear Greg continue in a low voice. "But you're right. My life is damn bad. I did everything right, maintained my dignity, acted honorably, and ended up a lonely old man without love and without those who love me. Love." Greg sat holding the cognac and watching his tears drip into the glass. End. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.